Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the PASC webinar on the government's planning consultation, which closes on the 7th of June. I'm going to be handing over momentarily to Duncan Tilney, who is the partner and co-head of planning at Stevens & Scone, who, as you'll be familiar with on these webinars, is our legal partner at PASC UK. So Duncan's going to go through the kind of just the key points for you to consider on the consultation. The Q&A is where to put your comments. If we can see the questions coming, that's when we will make sure we get through as many of them as possible. So please put your Q&A questions in there. We can see them and we will answer as many of those as possible. This is intended to take exactly an hour. So Duncan is going to start speaking momentarily. The paper that Duncan is going to run through is freely available to all on the PASC UK website. You just go to the homepage, scroll down the homepage, there's a link to the English consultations, and you will find all the assets for all of the consultation papers on both consultations. The statutory registration and the planning are all on that page. They are all free to use. They are in a Word format so that you can tailor your responses, and we encourage you to tailor your responses, as many individual responses as we can get it. And that is the objective of today, is to answer your questions on it so that you feel that you can confidently respond. So that's what we're about today. So not taking up any more time than is necessary of Duncan's very valuable time, I'm going to hand over to Duncan, who is going to introduce himself again, just to say what the background to this is, and then he's going to run through the key points of the paper. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Alistair. As Alistair says, I'm going to go through the paper. I will shortly share my screen with you with a copy of what's available on the PASC website and that I've produced with Alistair and with the PASC objectives in mind. But I think context is important. The consultation is about the process and the detail of a proposed change to create a new use class for short-term lets. But if you take a step back from the consultation, it starts from a position where the government has decided that there is a problem. It has loosely defined that problem by looking at the supply of housing generally in certain areas and over the country as a whole. It's looked at questions of what I think the government will call vitality within certain areas, and this is the sort of dying seaside town angle that the government would come from, and this is offered as a solution to that problem. What it has not done is it's not gone back and actually provided anything empirical by way of identifying that there really is a problem. What it has also not done is looked forward and said, okay, but short-term holiday lets because they're the subject of this consultation, fulfill a role in and of themselves, and they fit within a number of sectors, including the tourism sector. What is the likely impact on that? So there's a sense that we're starting off from a situation where the government has identified that the tool that it's got is a hammer, and therefore it is seeking to define every problem that it's got as a nail, because the two fit together. And it's worth holding that in mind as we go through, because a number of the questions that are being asked in the consultation, and we'll look at those shortly, do seem relatively innocuous, but they all start from a founding principle, which is that the housing supply shortage would be solved if there were fewer short-term and holiday lets. And thus far, that point hasn't been proved. I mean, we get into a broader discussion about you solve the supply of housing by supplying more housing, and you just build more houses. But that is not somewhere where this government wants to go. So this, to me, seems an uncomfortable halfway house. So I'm going to share the consultation briefing paper that I've produced, and it starts off with some of the administrative background. Just bring it up on the screen now. It starts off with some of the administrative background as how to respond and the date, and we've highlighted that. The first bit is my preamble, and I've already said that about, you know, how do we get to a position where this is something that the government is concerning itself with. I'm not going to go through all of the questions. I'm going to pick out what I think are some particularly pertinent points. So the first question goes back to my introduction, which is, and you can see the bias in it already, help to manage the increase in short-term lets. It's necessarily starting from a British position that says an increase in short-term lets is a bad thing. And to be honest, a government would only seek to put short-term lets into its own use category as a method of controlling the numbers and the management in and out of that use category. It serves absolutely no other purpose. There is no other reason why anyone would interfere with the use classes order at this point if it was not to manipulate the supply of short-term lets. So I don't want to sort of keep going back to number one. What I'm saying is put a marker in at question one, and every time you're going through a particular question, remind yourself of the context. Remind yourself this is a government that is unhappy about the current level of short-term lets. And there's nothing in here which talks about, or there's very little, that talks about particular areas, local authorities, geographical designators, national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty. But as we go through, you may be able to think about whether your particular circumstance is going to be higher up or lower down on the government's and therefore a local authority's priority list for whether your activities ought to be curtailed or further activity in your sector. So the second question, do you agree with it? What I've said in terms of a proposed answer is that the free text is probably more important than the question in itself. So do we agree if it's a good idea to achieve what? In and of itself, no, it's not a good idea. Why? Because it adds an administrative burden to an already overburdened planning system where it's unnecessary. And if one were to take a completely naive view of this and say the government's going to allow people to freely move between use class C3 dwelling house and use class C5 short-term let, well, if it's going to allow that free movement, then it's completely unnecessary. And so again, you go back to question one and go, we're going to come on to that later about how this can actually then be used to manage the supply of short-term lets. I have some issues with the description, and in fairness, it's the fine detail of the description is the sort of thing which really brings clarity to changes in the planning system. The disadvantage within the planning system is that it's exceptionally difficult to capture every possible alternative situation that could exist out there in the market. And the advantage of the current system is that assessments are made based on the factual circumstances on the ground as to whether something has or has not remained within the C3 dwelling use class. The danger of getting defined terms is that some things may be automatically excluded or automatically included, which wouldn't seem to support the government's objective. When we go on to look at question 5, for example, where it talks about different kinds of accommodation, I reflect on my personal circumstances where I have a child who is at university. They consider my home to still be their home, and therefore wherever they live is short-term accommodation. Does that mean that the house that she shares with one other person suddenly becomes a short-term holiday let or short-term let because it's not their permanent address? Was that the intention in terms of the government? Because she needs somewhere to live when she's at university. She's not flitting out on a weekly basis. Is that really the sort of delivery in the market that they want to be managing? And I know that for some people, either through the year for a proportion of their housing stock or over winter, or for example, that getting students in is a useful way of filling out the weeks outside the main summer season. So devil is in the detail. We wait to see what's going to come out of that, but already it sort of presages some of the complications when, as tends to be the way in these sorts of consultations, the person who's writing it has got a relatively fixed view of what they think the problem is. And they therefore have a relatively narrow view of how they think their solution could be applied. But if they're only looking at it in that singular fashion, they then necessarily exclude all of these other bits and pieces that are entirely legitimate uses of property, but not catered for within the current circumstances. So we move on and we look at question 6 and question 7, which are effectively the two sides of the same coin. Now, what this provides for is a permitted development right for the changes from C3 to C5 and C5 to C3. And so again, I'd say if there's going to be a permanent, untouched, permitted development right to move between C3 and C5 and C5 and C3, what would be the point of carving out a proportion of the current C3 housing stock and calling it C5? And the cynic in me, of which there's quite a lot, says that this question is intended to offer some comfort to consultees, effectively saying, you don't need to worry about the fact that we're bringing this in, because what we're also going to do is we're going to allow free movement between the two, at which point a fair number of people, I suspect, will say, well, that's absolutely fine. If that's going to be the case, I don't mind you bringing it in. But as I say, unless you're then going to seek to shrink the sector, there'd be no point in having it at all. An identical provision already exists for C4, which is houses in multiple occupation. So there's a permitted development right from C3 to C4 and from C4 to C3, except in, for example, Falmouth, Exeter city centre, parts of Plymouth, particularly down in Mutley Plain, and many other places, where what the local authorities have done is they've issued an Article 4 direction so that one of those permitted development rights is removed. So you can move from a C4 to a C3 in Plymouth. You cannot move from a C3 to a C4. And so what they've done is effectively created a ratchet effect. So, and I've dealt with such circumstances where a property has been a student HMO in Mutley for years, and then COVID came along and all the students went home and the landlords ended up with empty properties. So what they did was they let families move in and they became C3 dwelling houses. COVID resides, universities open up, they now have to make a planning application to become an HMO. And imagine what Plymouth City Council said. Thank you, no. You can continue to rent it as a C3, but you no longer have a permitted development right to revert to your former C4 use, and we do not welcome an application for you to do so. And that's come as an understatement, quite a disappointment to some of those people. So yes, fine, it's in there. Do we think it's a good idea? Yes, absolutely, we think it's a good idea. But as I've put in the briefing paper, it links into later questions, which are about the extent to which they may or may not be controlled. Question 8 is a sort of an interim question, which is about particular areas, and again I come back to this potential jarring of the objectives of the sector and jarring of the objectives of local authorities. So you might say, well, national parks particularly suffer, if that's the view that you take, if you see this as suffering, but also national parks will be areas where they've established vibrant tourist economies. So how do you reconcile the one with the other? How do you sell ice creams if there are no tourists? I'm being simplistic, and I hope you appreciate that I'm not seeking to be flippant here. We don't need to get into the absolute minutiae of this, but I'm sure you can all see that a reduction in the level of holiday housing stock in an area, it's inconceivable that isn't going to have knock-on implications of people who have built a business based on there being a particular level of holiday population at certain times of the year, which they then seek to serve. Question 9. Again, we're not going to go through all of them, but question 9, notification. Do we want people to be effectively self-reporting? This is all about the enforcement piece. This is all about when a property may have reverted to a C3 use, and then you want to get it back into the new C5 use. Should you be telling the local authority what you're doing? And again, there's a sort of underlying suspicion here. Local authorities want to be told what is going on so that they can have further data to be able to use to control what's going on. This isn't a conspiracy theory piece. It's just a matter of fact. You know, you want to designate it as a new use class. You want to register them. You want us to tell you when we exercise permitted development right to move into that. This is all part of a local authority wanting to be able to then set levels and say, no, threshold is reached, that's it, no more. And I suspect that is where it's going to go. There are some questions to do with householders, and this is, I say in the paper, a potential fudging of the statistics, and perhaps it doesn't apply to many of the people in this webinar, but it's there, I suppose, in a sense of trying to get a completeness of the picture of all the various circumstances under which people might let somebody else live in their house. That then links into planning fees, which we won't go through. The last one I was going to look at, which is Article 4 directions. So the local authority, if it wishes to do so, could invoke Article 4 of the permitted development order to prevent changes of use. They could do it as I've described previously and do it on a sort of ratchet basis and say, well, we'll allow them to go back to C3, but we won't allow them to go to C5. And they could do that on a very localized area, particular streets within a town, particular parishes. They could do it within the area of outstanding natural beauty as it sits within their local authority area. This is a cake that can be sliced in any number of ways. It seems to me inconceivable that that isn't going to be a power exercised by local authorities. They can be brought in on an immediate or a non-immediate basis, and that does or doesn't allow for the possibility of compensation for the loss or withdrawal of a right. But I suspect what the local authorities will do is do it on a non-immediate, on the basis that there isn't going to be a massive flood of people suddenly buying houses and converting them into C5 to get that done. And that then avoids the compensation, but it will then effectively put a ceiling on the amount of C5 accommodation that's out there in their area, and then they can start to make some policy decisions about whether that's the right level or whether they then need to start effectively scaling that back. They can't, without paying compensation, they can't force you out of the C5, but they can create a system which could see you fall out of the C5 unintentionally and unable to get back in. So there's nothing in here about when a property's empty. There's nothing in here about when a property's undergoing renovation works. And there could be all sorts of other unintended consequences where the local authority says, oh, but no, you've stopped using it for that. And now you'll have to make a planning application if you want to go back. So it's going to be a little bit backdoor, but my view, done the way that is possible within the normal operation of the system, that is achievable for a local authority, and it could squeeze the sector. That's what I was going to go through. We don't need to go through the Equality Act stuff at the end. We're 20 minutes in, and so I think the intention now, Alistair, is to open the floor for questions.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. I think there's a couple of kind of key questions here, and this almost goes back to when you and I first met, which was prior to actually this consultation being launched, when we talked about material change of use in a C5 and what that would cover. So if you just like tell the audience what you can do with a C5 today, which the council can't really interfere with, because
I think you mean a C3.
Sorry, C5, I'm going to ask you to explain in a minute. C3, which is what many of us currently have, what you would probably be classified as if you haven't got the planning designation because you've got an older property.
Yeah, so C3, there are three elements of C3. And so it's about, it covers effectively small care homes and what most people would describe as a home. And then there's a qualification as to the number of people living together as a single household. And so some of the examples are sort of small religious communities, your standard house. Interestingly, that a standard household has quite an expanded definition in terms of the people. So your nanny, your au pair, your butler, your driver, possibly, can all count as part of your household, and you can all live in this house together, and you can have lots of people if you've got a big house. Once you start letting your property to other people, there's a greater degree of scrutiny. But provided you don't step outside of the mode of use of the property being the use for people living as a single household, you don't step outside of C3. So you could let it to quite a number of people, provided they were living as a single household. Most properties don't lend themselves to being anything other than C3. by their very nature. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, small kitchen in a sort of town centre, short-term holiday let is going to struggle to be anything other than a C3. And at the moment, you can let that out for one night, a weekend, a week, a month, a season, or have it on a short hold tenancy for longer if you wanted to. There have been some fine distinctions drawn more recently. So there was a reported case where there was a manor house that had then was being let to essentially groups, and the examples given in the commentary on it are things like a cycling club or a choir group or something like that, and it was decided that had stepped outside of C3 into a sui generis, so not within a use class, of a commercial let. And the line that was crossed was essentially that on a practical level, there were too many of them to be living as a single household. Identified within them, there were the Smith family, the Jones family, the Tilney family, the Handyside family, so they clearly were separate households. There wasn't enough space for them all to sit down and eat. There were multiple areas for them to eat and cook. So there was a barbecue area, and there was an indoor area, and there was a snug. And they said, look, people are not going to be living here as a household outside C3. There were perhaps some particular circumstances that led to that. There have also been some recent appeal decisions where properties have been divided up. And this, I think it was where it was located near to an airport, without a lot of people staying for just one night. And that was decided that was a material change of use. And that is a slight mission creep. That's something that only come in very recently. But up until that point, all of this, let it out for a weekend, let it out for a week, let it out for a season, was all just C3.
Okay, so if for example, the majority of people on this call have got a C3 property that they may be letting for holiday let use, there isn't any great danger of retrospective change of that if they don't change the way that they are using it. Is that a very short summary of what you said, Duncan?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question, Alistair.
Right, you've said.
Could you rephrase it?
Right, so you've got people using C3 use at the moment, or they're classified by the council as C3 use.
Yes.
You're saying that I think you inferred without saying, and I'm trying to put you on the spot, that you wouldn't have to apply to continue, or there wouldn't be a retrospective change if you didn't change the way you were operating your C3.
Yeah, that's right. So if this consultation folds, they decide to do nothing, then everything will just stay as it is, and people will be just using their house or letting their house out to other people, but it will still be a dwelling house within C3. They're just, and it makes no difference whether I let it to someone for 2.5 years or whether I let it to someone for 2.5 days. It's still the C3. So the point that will come is that at the point that the consultation sees this being introduced, there will be a drop dead date, and the property will either be C3 or it will be C5, right. And then you will need to rely on the permitted development rights to move between the two. So people might find themselves thinking they were C5, but depending on how C5 is then defined, they might find they've fallen outside it, so they're only a C3. Or conversely, they might go, well, I was always fairly confident that I would continue to be a C3 because I relatively low letting rate, but depending on where the line is drawn for C5 and it is defined, they might find themselves owning a C5 holiday let. And what I sort of opine in the paper is, that again, unintended consequences, but money secured on the property subject to conditions, insurance subject to conditions,
mortgage
subject to conditions. Yeah.
So this is something that we've really got to be very careful of because of the implications you have for mortgages and insurance, because some mortgages don't allow you to be a short-term let, and you might.
Indeed.
Okay,
Indeed,
so
and you might have said, well, I'm a C3 and I'm letting someone, I'm letting someone do it, but it's still a dwelling house. It is what it is.
So if an Article 4 came in that was quite hard, so this goes really badly, and a C5 and an Article 4 area is designated on Southley Parish in East Devon, my parish in East Devon, an Article 4 on that. How retrospective might that be? If someone's been trading in that parish as a short-term let for a good period of time, and we might come to some discussion about that in a second. But if they would they suddenly find that somebody from the council knocked on their door and said you can't do it anymore?
The way that they operate, they don't withdraw existing rights. What they do is they withdraw the permitted development right to change from one use to another use. And so what matters is what use you are in at the time that the Article 4 comes in and removes your ability to move. So you link the Article 4 with the way in which C5 is defined, because your worst case scenario is they say, we've brought in an Article 4, which means you can't change from C3 to C5. And you say, well, that's fine. I was a C5 already. And they say, I think if you check the definition of C5, actually you're a C3.
Okay.
Because you're operating within the scope that we've given within C3. So they could say, we're going to give flexibility to C3 that you can let your property for up to pick a number 90 days a year and still remain within C3, which would then mean when the use classes order comes in, you're a C3, not a C5. They then remove the permitted development right through the Article 4 to stop you going from C to C3 to C5. So 90 days, you're fine. You want to do 91 days, you need planning permission.
Right. So this is almost turning into a classic PASS webinar where the answer is, it depends. It depends on.
I'm sorry.
No, it does.
It does. And the devil is in the detail, and the detail isn't really here.
No,
and that's
the conclusion.
No, but so you're being asked to make these consultation responses on some quite broad questions.
Yes.
And the answer is, well, how does that link with that? What is government guidance going to be on the use of the Article 4 for this particular permitted development rights? What policy is a particular local authority going to have in place for this particular article, for this PD right and the use of Article 4? More importantly, on the drop dead date when the use class order changes, where am I likely to fit, and am I going to fall into a category that I want to be in? What am I then going to have to do in the time? Am I going to have to suddenly go, crikey, I had a bit of a couple of off seasons, but I really want to ramp up. I now need to artificially ramp up immediately to get myself into the now newly defined C5 before I have my ability to do so removed. And at the moment, if someone came and said, oh, this is my business pattern, am I going to be okay? I don't know.
Okay.
Nobody knows.
So do you think it's likely that Article 4, the definition of a C5, would vary by county, or do you think that is likely to be a national level playing field? Right, that's a nice clear answer. But Article 4 areas are down to local councils to set.
Yes, and they can include and exclude things, so it doesn't have to be quite so blanket. So they could say, we're going to we're going to remove this in this area, this street, this whatever. They could finesse that slightly, so they could allow some flexibility in it. There's a bit of future gazing here, obviously, but so they could say, well, we will allow you to do it, but we'll only allow you to do it up to this threshold.
Right.
So they'll say, if you're over 60 days, you step into C5. We're removing the PD for C5 as a sort of total. However, we will allow you to exercise it for a further 30 days or something. And effectively, you've then got a slider, they've then got sort of gradual withdrawal. I was dealing with a matter in a national park where there was a removal of the 28-day permitted development right as it related to pop-up campsites. But then there was a caveat that they said it won't apply provided you were already established in 2020. So if you've been doing this for 3 years, we'll let you continue on. Or if you're going to be doing this, but you're not going to have more than 30 tents, we're going to let you carry on doing it. So they might say, you can do it provided you've got no more than 2 bedrooms or something.
Right.
They might sort of take the opportunity to subdivide it. So they could say, if it's family-sized properties, you can't change the C5, but if it's 2 bedrooms or fewer, then you can.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, any consultation outcome depends on the outcome of the consultation and how the government interprets the response they get to them and how they choose to interpret that. Well, let's just say this is not great. It doesn't go very well. How quickly do you think any of these changes might actually take place? Do you think they might have to go through further consultation on some of these individual points that we're raising?
I would be that there are circumstances, and a lot of it's all local factors. A local authority may feel that through one mechanism or another, something existing in terms of housing land availability, affordable housing demand, consultations previously on extension of housing into the green belt, provide them with a sufficient evidence base for them to say, you know what, as soon as this comes in, we're going to go for an Article 4 to at least block out these areas for no further expansion of it. And then we will look to, often they governments and local authorities can regulate things out of existence. They can just, they create a burden whereby people saying, unless you're doing this at this level, it's just not worth it. Look at the number, restaurants that don't have alcohol licenses, because they go, you know what, it's more trouble than it's worth, but for the amount that we sell.
Right.
So it could come in quite quickly in some areas. And a lot of that's just down to local politics, I'm afraid.
Okay. Right. I'm going to go through some of the questions now because I was trying to do the kind of more general interpretation of questions. Listed buildings don't currently have permitted development rights. One of our listeners has said, would they be able to change under question 6? So do you think that might overwrite that?
So it's not actually true to say that listed buildings don't have permitted development rights. Listed buildings often have fewer permitted development rights than other buildings, but it's not necessarily the case that they don't have any permitted development rights. But I take your point. It's one of the things that when they draft the permitted development right, they will decide where it will or won't apply. So certain PD rights do or don't apply to national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, SSSIs, World Heritage sites, listed buildings. So that is something where they could decide. But again, and it comes back to this, these are all interlinked. A lot, whether you need to rely on the permitted development right depends on how you're defined on the drop dead day on which the use class order changes. Because if you're already C5 and you want to stay C5, you wouldn't need to rely on the permitted development right. The PD right is sold as an ability to limit the expansion of it, but that depends on whether everything that you consider is currently a short-term holiday let actually ends up being defined as being a short-term holiday let on the day that the new use class order comes into effect.
Okay, so at some point, one of the big questions is going to be, should people, if they want to continue, should they perhaps be thinking about applying for planning consent to be a holiday let? And I don't want to put the answer too much to you, but surely that kind of question probably can't be answered until we have a clearer idea of the outcome of which bits of this actually get further consideration, because not all of this consultation, from experience, will they ever deal with all of the things simultaneously that they're saying. That's a very unlikely outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that very few of these sorts of things survive first contact with the enemy. There's an extent to which an application for planning permission is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you felt minded to apply for express planning permission to be short-term holiday let, and they allowed it now in May 2023, they would have probably allowed it in, will probably allow it in May 2024, after the youth classes order comes in, because either it fits with what they want in that particular local authority's mix of housing and accommodation in its particular area, or it doesn't. And I think where it will be worth looking at is, and again, it's sort of fact and circumstance specific. If you think that there is going to be on the cards, there is a proposal for a large amount of purpose-built holiday accommodation. So there's about to be a sort of massive expansion of a holiday park somewhere, and somewhere in your mind you're thinking, right, the local authority is going to say that provides our all year round quality tourism accommodation, fine, purpose built. We'd quite like a lot more of our bricks and mortar to be occupied as C3 dwellings. That might put pressure on some of that existing bricks and mortar holiday stock. But the problem is that if you're thinking about it, the local authority is probably thinking about it as well. So if you're thinking, I might like to secure this because I think that's going to put pressure on it, it's probably already putting pressure on it, and they might just turn it down.
Okay, I think I've got a lot of questions to try and get through, and we've got 15 minutes, so we're going to try and go as quickly as possible through them. What we will commit to on this webinar is that once we have a much clearer idea of the direction of travel on this, that will indicate what options are open to operators who've got different levels of operation and different classifications, and we may be able then to advise a bit more specifically on the best steps forward at that time. At the moment, this is like a preemptive strike to go back and say, no, we don't want these things. And that's really, and I'm being asked, is this not a good thing to deal with oversupply? The past position is not to say that we are here to solve the second home crisis on this call. Okay, the second home crisis is a multifarious, huge problem, which we accept. However, we would also state that nobody on this call who's currently operating is probably doing so illegally. They bought a property that they can legally operate as a dwelling, or they've got a property that's currently got planning permission. So what we're very resistant to is people losing rights to properties that they bought when they bought those properties. Nobody's done anything illegal to get to this point. And that's where we're just a bit cognizant. This is people's properties that we're talking about. There are other ways that we can talk about to deal with the second home crisis. We could have a call about that, but that is not what we're dealing with today. We are dealing with how to respond to this to try and mitigate any limitations it might have on the use of your property. So that answers a lot of the.
I think if I can just interject, the question of oversupply is fine, but in saying if you believe there's an oversupply and you believe that oversupply should be corrected by government action rather than any other mechanism. Before I signed up to that, I'd want to be very clear about which side of the line I fell.
Yeah.
Whether I was part of the existing supply or whether I was part of the bit that's going to be defined out of it, and suddenly find that I voted for Christmas and I walked past a mirror and realised I'm a turkey.
Yeah.
No offence to the person who answered the question, but in asking the question about, couldn't this deal with that, and I'd be all right because I'm already doing it, always assumes that once the new use class comes in, you will continue to be defined as you think you are defined now, and you will be able to continue your operation as you're doing it now, and you won't find that you're inadvertently the wrong side of the line, having just voted or allowed, because the way you respond to the consultation, you supported a contraction, and you find that you're in the bit that gets contracted.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions which I'll try and belt through quickly. It says, will current holiday let properties that are registered on business rates automatically be classified to a C5, or will they have to apply? I mean, we don't know that, actually, is the answer, because it's ill-determined. But by law in England, in order to claim small business rates relief, you have to show on a valuation form 6048 that you've done more than 70 days let, 140 days applicable. So your council would know, because they're the billing authority, that you've done more than 70 days because you're on the business rate system. So yes, there is potential for that to join up. There's another question about, could this mean the end of small business rates relief? There has always been a danger that CAT 151, which is the self-catering business rates list, loses small business rates relief. There's a consultation in Wales, which probably means that's going to happen in Wales. It's a bit of an anomaly. SBIR was there because of a massive rates increase, which the George Osborne introduced all those years ago, which meant that the government had to come up with a big policy quickly to avert a riot, and they brought in small business rates relief up to businesses doing 12,000 quid. That was probably aimed more at the high street and small industrial businesses than second homes and holiday lets in Cornwall or Devon or whatever. So we've always been at risk to lose that one. So yes, that is a potential outcome. Regardless of this, that's always been a potential outcome.
And it could be that the government says, you know what, dealing with this through the planning system is not the most efficient way of doing it. We'll do it through the tax system.
Yeah, that's
we'll make it uneconomic. And you already see that in residential letting, in what can and can't be offset against income for tax purposes that are just trashing the yields, and that's why there's a problem in the private rented sector, because people are selling up because they say there's no longer a margin in being a private landlord. I'll just take the capital gain and go.
Yeah. Okay. We don't know. There's a question about whether there might be, if neighbours can claim and you've got a C5. We have no idea of the detail on how councils may have any kind of compliance testing going in. That will be probably someone who's got an educated view on what's happening with licensing in Scotland, where yes, a neighbour can complain and you can't operate. This in England, it will be much less than that. It will be. It's just will be. So let's worry about that when it comes.
There's an interesting point on that, is that the whole law of nuisance, for example, is about context. So what would be a nuisance in one area would not necessarily be a nuisance in another area because of the particular circumstances of it. So the noise environment in a city, in an urban area, is always greater than in the countryside, and therefore a noise being emitted from a property in a city is less likely to pass the threshold of being a nuisance. And the planning system interacts in this, because when a planning authority gives planning permission for a factory, it also effectively gives license to the noise, the light, the transport movements, the people movements, and everything else that's associated with that being a factory. And so, ironically, if if the local authority then say that's C5, that's a holiday let, in a sense that removes a neighbour's ability to complain on the basis it's being used as a holiday let, because it then has specific planning permission to be a holiday let, and the local authority has accepted everything that goes with it being a holiday let.
Okay.
A bit of a double-edged sword, really.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question about the Equality Act. What that we have this comes up quite a lot when members are trying to apply for a planning permission in an area and they're looking specifically at providing an accessible property. How councils don't actually recognise that it's specifically being built as an accessible property. I doubt that it will go as wide as to cover that kind of detail, but that is always something that a good case can be made eventually, that they are not, as a council, they would not be providing accessible accommodation. And that we've seen that being able to call those councils to account on that. So I think that would probably continue. I'm not trying to look. The national park question, I'm trying to find, so just give me a second to find that, because I'm sure national park, right. Okay, I'll read the question so that people can hear it. Within the Lake District National Park, any change of use or new build via their core strategy will have a local occupancy clause. And we're seeing this being proposed in outside national parks as well, actually. There are some, I think Penzance have something like this on new builds. I think it does. So
yeah, there are some neighbourhood plans that
require preclude holiday letting. So that has two sides to that. So it's double-sided sword. And if you're in the Lake District National Park and you're going to get classified as being able to continue to trade, you're probably not going to have very much more competition coming. But if you wanted to expand in that area or enter that area, you probably wouldn't be able to. Do you have something to say about how these park authorities and people like that would be able to manipulate any kind of legislation coming from this to further restrain, or would they be left with Article 4, which you've covered as well? Would they be using that measure as well?
So I think they will. There's two routes. Article 4 is then about sort of changes with existing properties, but I think what this new use class also presages is the idea that when you get planning permission for a building that previously we would have thought of as a house within C3 that I can live in or I can let out and run as a business, if you want to run it as a business, you will have to apply for the construction of a holiday let. It would have to be, and that would then link into the policy that will then be part of that suite of saying, for whom do we exist? That's a really difficult question, because you say, well, you're putting one brick on top of another, that should be somewhere for someone to live, and you go, yes, but the 12 groups that circle through that in and around a core summer holiday effectively contribute to 5 full-time equivalent jobs in the national park. Where's the balance? I don't think there's an answer to it, but it's once you get this separation, it's another topic within policy documents for people to say, what are we doing about C5? What's our policy on that now? Okay,
so I mean, a repeat question we're getting is almost as simple as, is the new planning class going to be applied retrospectively? Is there a straightforward answer to that, Duncan?
So the way that it is envisaged in the consultation is that on a given date, C5 will come into existence. It's how it's sort of in outline in the consultation. It will come into existence. There will not be a need for people to apply to be in one or the other. The definition will simply decide, and you will either own a C3 or you will own a C5. And so in that respect, it sort of is retrospective in that it will capture at the moment that it comes in, there will be a divide, and you'll be on one side or the other. You will either be a C5 or you'll be a C3 without having done anything, just by virtue of wherever that line is drawn between the two.
And we have no idea where that line is going to be drawn currently.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So,
And that's particularly because they ask about, should homeowners be entitled to, one presumes what they mean is people who are living in it for 40 weeks a year be entitled to rent it out for the other 12 weeks a year, for example, without having to move out of C3. And I think it's going to be linked with that. It's the difficulty. The moment you scratch the surface on this and you start asking questions that link to the real world, it becomes quite difficult.
yeah. So two things I'm going to say as we come towards the end. One is, as soon as anything becomes clear on a direction of travel on this, we should convene another advice paper and we should have another webinar, because at the moment we're having to say on all of this, it depends, because we have no you've written the background, which is we can see what the direction of travel is, but we don't know what the destination is yet. So
and we don't know who's going to be on board and who's going to be left on the platform.
Yes, exactly. So as soon as we get further information, we will keep these webinars and papers coming out so that people can make those business decisions as quickly as they can, and we can try and remove as many of the "it depends" as possible. The second thing I would say is, I think this is why, when you go back to what Duncan started with, that critical question one is, do we want this new planning class? And I think the answer is probably, for many of you, that you probably don't, because they can do a lot of this stuff without messing us about as much as this would. I think this is quite a major intervention, and it could be looked at in lots of other ways. So I'm just going to see if there are any drop dead day. There's a lot of questions coming in about how soon. We don't know, and we can't answer that. All I'd say is these things tend to have to go through some part of parliamentary scrutiny in order to change this kind of stuff. They may or may not, but we're going to. This consultation is closing in June. Then they'll look at the evidence, and then the government goes into recess. So I don't think you're looking about the first week of the summer holidays being affected here, but it could be reasonably quickly. So we will absolutely keep a watching brief on that and keep people up to date in the newsletters. We will continue to work with professional advice on this to make sure that you are kept up to date as far as we can. We're coming to the last minute. The guidance is there. It's free to anybody who wants to download it. We are asking that you give your information to get it, because we want to send you a note to remind you that you only have until the 7th of June to do it. We are providing this free of charge to the whole sector, and we want to make sure that we get as many responses in as possible. Bear in mind that this particular consultation may have a lot of trolling in it, saying no more second homes ever, no more second homes ever. And that is not a policy. That is not an answer. That's just an opinion. Okay, so we've got to make sure that we come up with sensible responses as steered by the response. Please don't cut and paste. Please try and find a way of nuancing it using your own words. That makes them much more effective. So please answer the survey, not the survey, the consultation. We've given you loads and loads and loads of notes, the background to the question, the consequences, so that you can think about how this affects you, your property. And this is where you've got to think vaguely, selfishly. Your response is about you. It's about you. It's your response to it. We'll do an industry response. Other people will do an industry response. You know where we're coming from, and hopefully you've got enough information now to at least give that response a shot. We know it's overcomplicated. We've made the point that it's overcomplicated. There's a level of acceptance that it's overcomplicated, which may help us when we try and negotiate during the period of reflection on this and when they look at the evidence. Okay, at that point, it's time for me to say thank you very much indeed, Duncan. Look forward to seeing, we've got another one this afternoon for another group of businesses. So I shall see Duncan this afternoon, but thank you all very much indeed. Look forward to receiving your comments and questions after this will be recorded and placed on the website. It's 12 o'clock. Thank you all very much indeed for attending. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.